Alright, it's time for a new wave of imperialism in European history. So I reckon we ought to talk about why the Europeans did it, which is to say their motivations, and how the Europeans did it, which is to say their methods. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So remember that when this course began in 1450, there was a surge in European imperialism as Western European states began sailing west across the Atlantic and east into the Indian Ocean. And in this period, there is a new wave of European imperialism, and it's going to focus on Africa and Asia. Now, by definition, imperialism is when one country extends political dominance over another country. And why would another country want to do that? Well, I got 3 reasons for it. Oh, and if you're studying for an exam, don't forget to check out my AP Euro review pack, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Link in description. Okay, the first motivation for the second wave of European imperialism was economic. Now remember, many of the states in Western Europe were in the heyday of the Industrial Revolution during this period, and they were getting fabulously wealthy as a result. But in order to keep those factories working, states needed 2 things: raw materials and markets. They needed raw materials like cotton and rubber and iron in order to make the final manufactured goods coming out of the factory. And once a nation had tapped all their own resources, they went looking in other places of the world to get those raw materials. So there was a significant motivation there for the new imperial venture. But once the goods were finished, they also needed people to buy those manufactured goods. And when the markets at home became saturated, they needed to go take over other countries so that they could open those new markets in other places. For example, once the British government took control over India after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, they began to exploit the Indians to gain valuable raw materials, not least cotton. But also, since there were something like 300 million people living in India, the British now had 300 million people to whom they could sell those manufactured textiles, and the wealth came pouring into the British coffers as a result. And starting in this period, the British colonized a few places in West Africa and then a huge swath of territory right down the eastern side of the entire continent. In Africa, the British were mainly interested in gaining access to raw materials like coal and oil and copper. The British also turned their imperialistic gaze upon China, but in China they engaged in economic imperialism rather than political imperialism, and the story went a little something like this. The British trade with the Chinese was fundamentally out of balance. The Brits wanted Chinese tea by the metric buttload, but there wasn't as much the Chinese wanted from the British. So as British money is flowing into China, there is no Chinese money flowing into Britain, and that's going to be a problem for the British. Now, I'd like to tell you that the British addressed this issue by asking the Chinese what kinds of products they wanted and then used innovative thinking to create goods that the Chinese wanted, and then the trade imbalance was corrected. But that's not what the British did. Instead, they began smuggling the highly addictive drug called opium into China from India. And it didn't take long for the Chinese to get hooked on this drug, and because India had prime growing conditions for opium, the British illegally imported it into China by the metric buttload. And if that sounds a little underhanded to you, well, then the Chinese officials of that time would agree with you. In 1839, the Chinese government seized like 20,000 pounds of opium being imported into China and destroyed it. And along with a couple other smaller incidents, this event led to the first opium war between Britain and China. Now, China had been exceedingly sluggish when it came to adapting to the new industrial world, but not Britain. Remember, Britain was essentially the first mover in the Industrial Revolution, and so they had a much greater advantage in weaponry against the Chinese. Needless to say, the British won this war and the Second Opium War, which also included France, and forcibly opened trading rights into China. Okay, now the second motivation for the second wave of imperialism was political. Now, I've been talking a lot about Britain because they were arguably the big dog of the second wave of European imperialism. But that doesn't mean that other European states didn't get in on the party too. Several European nations were clamoring for territory in Africa, including the French and the Dutch and the Belgians, and this became known as the Scramble for Africa. And this dirty clamoring for African territory began to cause significant tension among these states. Once the interior of Africa was mapped by agents of Belgian King Leopold, European states raced to claim territories before other states got to them, and that would cause significant tension that we're going to consider in the next video. And the third motivation for the second wave of imperialism was a belief in racial superiority. Recall a couple videos ago when we talked about the budding racialist philosophy called social Darwinism. By the late 19th century, that ideology had taken full root and provided the motivation for strong nations with advanced civilizations, at least that's how they saw themselves, to take over weak nations with primitive civilizations. Like when you contrasted the wealth and power that industrialized nations in Europe had accumulated with the relative poverty of places in Africa, a social Darwinist would conclude that clearly Western nations were superior. Western nations have adapted better to their environment and thus are not only surviving, but thriving. Therefore, if the strong eat the weak by the laws of nature, why shouldn't the strong nations eat the weak nations? But if you would ask these Europeans directly if what they were doing was morally wrong, yeah, they would have laughed. Of course it's not wrong, and one of the main reasons is because they truly believed they were bringing the glories of Western civilization to bear on people who desperately needed it. The French term for this was the mission civilisatrice, which when being translated means the civilizing mission. In other words, by European reckoning, imperialism was good for the colonized because they got access to the best culture the world had to offer. And probably the clearest manifestation of the beliefs of European racial superiority is a poem by Rudyard Kipling called White Man's Burden. In it, he talks about the peoples of Africa and calls them half devil and half child. And therefore, the white man ought to send the best ye breed in order to serve your captives' needs. And so if this was the belief imperial nations clung to, then it was not an evil to imperialize another weaker nation, but rather benevolence and mercy to bring them the glories of Western culture. Now, I probably don't need to tell you that Africans and Asians were not as jazzed about the glories of Western culture as the Europeans were. In fact, in many cases, they put up stiff resistance against European intrusion into their homelands. But unfortunately, Europeans had several advantages that gave them the upper hand against those who resisted. The first advantage Europeans had was advanced weaponry, and I cannot emphasize enough just how much the Industrial Revolution contributed to this advantage. Guns were updated to include a rifled barrel, which means there were spiral grooves cut along the inside of them, which increased the accuracy of the shot. Additionally, the mini ball was invented, which was a conical bullet which was more accurate and did way more damage than the traditional musket ball. Additionally, Europeans manufactured the breech-loading rifle, in which bullets could be loaded much quicker, and they had access to machine gun technology, which could fire hundreds of rounds at great speed. The point is, Europeans had weapons that could deliver lead into the bodies of those who opposed them much quicker than anyone who resisted them. The second advantage Europeans had was new communication and transportation technology. Communication was enhanced by the speed of the telegraph and the ability to run cables under the water and at great length. This enabled coordination in both conquering territory and maintaining power once it was conquered. And once territories were conquered, imperializing nations got to work quickly building up infrastructure, the most significant of which was railroads. In this way, raw materials and manufactured goods could be transported in and out and around these colonies with great speed. And the third advantage Europeans had was advances in medicine. Now, the reason Europeans hadn't pushed into the interior of Africa prior to this was because of a disease found there called malaria. But thanks to French scientists who discovered that quinine could fend off the disease, Europeans could invade the interior of Africa without fear of contracting. Additionally, thanks to the work of French chemist Louis Pasteur, Europeans finally began to understand what caused diseases. He discovered the germ theory of disease, which said that people got sick or, amputated limbs got infected or whatever because of tiny microorganisms called germs. Once he discovered this, a new revolution in hospital care emerged in which antiseptics were used and cleanliness in surgical tools was paramount. Now, I know that sounds pretty great, but in terms of imperialism, that meant that European troops could be vaccinated against diseases and thus remain healthier on the battlefield, and if they got hurt, then they would have a much better chance of survival. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for AP Euro Unit 7. Additionally, click here if you want note guides to follow along with these videos so you can actually learn the material I'm giving you. And hey, I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.